There are 6 main constitutional principles that you need to know for this section. Number 1 is popular sovereignty. Simply put, it means rule by the people. The people have the power to select their leaders and therefore control the government. The second one is federalism. This is a division of power between the state and national governments. The states can do some things, the national government can do other things, and there's some shared powers that you will learn about later on. The third constitutional principle is the separation of powers, or checks and balances. This will make sure that not one part of the government becomes too powerful. It divides up the responsibilities and also allows branches to stop the other branches from gaining too much power. The fourth one is called republicanism. This is the idea that our government is a representative government with virtue. We elect our representatives to make those decisions for us. Number 5 is limited government. This is basically taken care of by the Bill of Rights. We are limiting the power of the government through the 9th and 10th Amendments. And finally, individual rights. Our government gives us individual rights that are protected by the Bill of Rights. The President's Cabinet, the heads of the executive branch departments, is one of the most constant and durable parts of the United States government. From George Washington to today, the chief executive has used the institution to collect information, get advice, and then carry out its policies. Yet, despite its importance, the cabinet isn't even included in the Constitution. With the first bill introduced in the U.S. Senate, which became the Judiciary Act of 1789, the judicial branch began to take shape. The act set up the federal court system and set guidelines for the operation of the U.S. Supreme Court, which at the time had 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. The Judiciary Act of 1789 also established a federal district court in each state, and in both Kentucky and Maine, which then were parts of other states. In between these 2 tiers of the judiciary were the U.S. Circuit Courts, which would serve as the principal trial courts in the federal system. The election of 1796 was the first election in American history where political candidates at the local, state, and national level began to run for office as members of organized political parties that held strongly opposed political principles. The 2 parties adopted names that reflected their most cherished values. The Federalists of 1796 attached themselves to the successful campaign in favor of the Constitution and were solid supporters of the federal administration. Although Washington denounced parties as a horrid threat to the Republic, his vice president, John Adams, became the de facto presidential candidate of the Federalists. The party had its strongest support amongst those who favored Hamilton's policies. Merchants, creditors, and urban artisans who had built a growing commercial economy of the Northeast provided its most dedicated supporters and strongest regional support. The opposition party adopted the name Democratic Republicans, which suggested that they were more fully committed to extending the revolution to ordinary people. The supporters of the Democratic Republicans, often referred to as the Republicans, were drawn from many segments of American society and included farmers throughout the country with high popularity among German and Scots-Irish ethnic groups. Although it effectively reached ordinary citizens, its key leaders were wealthy Southern tobacco elites like Jefferson and Madison. While the Democratic Republicans were more diverse, a major problem facing the first federal government was how to deal with the financial chaos created by the American Revolution. States had huge war debts. There was runaway inflation. Almost all areas of the economy looked dismal throughout the 1780s. Economic hard times were a major factor, creating the sense of crisis that produced the stronger central government under the new Constitution. The first issue that Hamilton tackled as Washington's Secretary of the Treasury concerned the problem of public credit. Governments at all levels had taken on so much debt during the Revolution. The commitment to pay them back was not taken very seriously. By the late 1780s, the value of such public securities had. The major issue that George Washington had to deal with in his presidency was the French Revolution. Americans generally supported the French people, but were horrified by reports of mob hysteria and mass executions. The U.S.-French alliance remained in effect with the French monarchy, but not the Revolutionary Republic. Thomas Jefferson supported the French revolutionaries. Many argued we should join the French since the British were seizing American merchant ships headed for French ports. The French minister to the U.S., Edmond Genet, broke all normal rules of diplomacy and appealed directly to the American people to change Washington's policy. This united Washington's cabinet together to ask for Genet's resignation. The French government recalled Genet home, but he remained behind, marrying and eventually becoming a U.S. citizen. Washington didn't think the U.S. was strong enough to engage in a European war and issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793. Thomas Jefferson disagreed and resigned from the cabinet to prepare to run for president. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay the federal excise tax on whiskey and attacked revenue collectors. Washington federalized 15,000 state militiamen under Hamilton's command. The Whiskey Rebellion collapsed without any bloodshed, a sharp contrast to Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation. Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay on a special mission to Britain to tuck the country out of its illegal practice of searching and seizing American ships and impressing the American sailors into the British Navy. Jay brought back a treaty in which Britain agreed to abandon its posts on the U.S. western frontier, but it said nothing about the impressment. The Jay Treaty was ratified but not very popular. However, it did keep the U.S. out of war with Britain. A year later, afraid that the Jay Treaty meant the U.S. was drawing closer to Britain, it came to an agreement with the U.S., opening the lower Mississippi River and New Orleans to American trade without paying duties to the Spanish government. They also agreed that Florida's northern boundary was at the 31st parallel. In 1796, as his second term in office drew to a close, President George Washington chose not to seek re-election. Mindful of the precedent his conduct set for future presidents, Washington feared that if he were to die while in office, Americans would view the presidency as a lifetime appointment. Instead, he decided to step down from power, providing the standard of a two-term limit that would eventually be protected in the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. Washington expressed what he hoped would serve as a guiding principle for the young country. First, he stressed the importance of national union to create happiness for U.S. citizens. He argued that patriotism should be more important than local factors, which could destroy the nation. Second, he explains two other threats to the nation, one domestic and one foreign. Washington warned that political parties were dangerous because they allowed a minority to control the will of the nation instead of the people as a whole. The foreign threat was permanent alliances with European powers, which could pull the U.S. into a war. The election of 1796 saw the Federalists run Vice President John Adams against the Democratic-Republican Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Adams won by 3 Electoral College votes. The Constitution states that the runner-up serve as Vice President. This led to the passage of the 12th Amendment providing for the method of selecting the Vice President. The Federalists in Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which authorized the President to deport any aliens considered dangerous, and made it illegal for newspaper editors to criticize either the President or Congress. Republican leaders challenged the federal laws in their state legislatures, Thomas Jefferson in Kentucky and James Madison in Virginia. The argument is that the states had entered into a compact in forming the national government, and therefore if any act of the federal government broke that compact, a state could nullify the federal law. This will set the stage in the pre-Civil War period. The current crisis will fade when the Republicans win a majority in Congress and when the Supreme Court starts to assert its powers to check the constitutionality of federal laws. French warships began to seize American merchant ships. President Adams sent a delegation to Paris to negotiate with the French government. Certain French ministers, known as X, Y, and Z because their names were never revealed, requested bribes as the basis for entering into negotiations. The Americans refused. The American public fumed. Federalists wanted war. Adams stood up to his party and sued for peace because he knew the U.S. Army and Navy were not strong enough to fight a major power. As a result of the XYZ affair, the U.S. fought a brief, undeclared war with France at sea between 1798 and 1800. It involved both navies and privateers attacking each other's shipping in the West Indies. The U.S. Navy focused on attacking French West Indian privateers. Meanwhile, President Adams rejected anti-French war hawks in the Federalist Party and negotiated peace by 1800. The Napoleonic Wars between 1795 and 1815 affected the U.S. economy because both Britain and France attempted naval blockades of enemy ports. The real problem was Britain and their continued impressment of U.S. sailors. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed during this period. It authorized the president to deport aliens considered dangerous and to detain enemy aliens in time of war. The Sedition Act made it illegal for newspaper editors to criticize the president or Congress and imposed fines or imprisonment for editors who violated the law. This led to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Democrat-Republicans argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated the First Amendment rights. Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. It declared that states had entered into a compact in forming the national government, and therefore if any act of the federal government broke the compact, a state could nullify the federal law. This concept will be used throughout the period prior to the Civil War. It's not an issue because the election of 1800 swept in Democratic Republicans into Congress, which officially ended the Alien and Sedition Acts. The election of 1800 swept the Federalists out of power in the executive and legislative branches of government. Jefferson actually tied with Republican Aaron Burr for electoral votes. The vote went into the House. Alexander Hamilton's people finally gave the vote to Jefferson because they respected him more. There was a peaceful transition of power from one political party to another. This rarely happened during this time period, which is why it's sometimes often referred to as the Peaceful Revolution or the Revolution of 1800.